Hey guys, once again, welcome back to the Go and Chess Show. This is your friend Anurag, and the candidate keeps getting interesting day by day. And today we had yet another interesting game played out between Vachier and Nepo. So, without further ado, let's just dive straight into it and see what we can learn from it. So, let's get started. Well, the game started out with e4 and e6. Nothing surprising here from Nepo because he has played it earlier in the tournament against Kirill. And after d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, we are once again heading into the win over. And after e5, c5, a3, bishop c3, bc3, knight e7. Once again, Vachier goes out with h4 here. It's getting popular these days, and h4 is being played very often. Queen c7, but here instead of going with knight f3 like Kirill did in the game earlier against Nepo in this tournament, Vachier went with h5 here, which is also an interesting choice. Knight f3 definitely is played more often, but h5 is also played quite a lot. And now here Vachier went with Nepo went with h6 here, which is definitely the main line here. But let's look at what happens after c into d4, because black does win a pawn this way. C into d4, clearly queen d4 would be totally horrible with knight c6 coming. That would be terrible. And after c d4, queen c3, bishop d2, queen into d4, knight f3, queen e4 check, bishop e2. Black does have his queen placed a little bit awkwardly on e4, and it may be vulnerable to some ideas of rook h4. So if black tries to play knight f5, white has played king f1 quite a lot here. Castling, I believe, is a little bit has its own benefits, but does kill white's possibilities of maybe attacking with h6 and also trying to activate the rook via the h file like white would have liked to. So king f1, I believe, stays in the spirit of this, and maybe white can try some ideas of rook b1 or something. We are not really sure what would have panned out in the game. I'm sure they would have other ideas, but I believe like b6, bishop a6 is an idea that black can try out here in this position, and black is considerably fine, although white has a lot of compensation for the pawn. So that did not really happen in the game, and after h5, black played h6, definitely the main move. Rook b1 was played out by Vachier, which is definitely not the main move here. Knight f3 is played significantly more often in this position. Sorry, my bad. Knight f3 is played significantly more often here in this position, and it's a normal developing move, for say, but Rook b1 is an interesting choice here. Now, this does take away black's possibility of taking on d4 and following the plan that we saw on the previous move, because now after queen c3, the rook on a1 is no longer attacked, so white can simply play queen d2 and deal with it. He does have the pair of bishops if the game goes on into the endgame, and after this, maybe he can also try to activate his rook to the other side via the h3 route, and that would be a nice way to get the rook into the game. But he can also go for complications with bishop d2, and after queen b4, knight f3, once again after queen e4, bishop e2, white now has an added possibility of trying to activate his other rook via the b4 square, which could create some definite problems for this queen on e4. And also the h1 rook can also come into the game via h4, and that would also be a good way to play out this position. So we don't know for what would happen, but both moves are equally good and interesting here. cd4 clearly is not a good choice here for black. Well, here Nepo went with b6, and as you can see, Vachier went with queen g4 immediately here, which shows the exact reason why he did not play knight f3 earlier in the game. It's a better square for the queen to get some activity going, and we'll see how it turned out later. Rook g8 was played in the game, but let's have a closer look at what happens after c into d4. This should be met with queen into g7. Clearly, c into d4 and queen into c2 would be a terrible thing for white to face here in this position. So after queen into g7, rook g8, queen into h6, queen into c3, and queen into e5. These are two choices here available for black. But after queen into c3, we have queen d2. Bishop d2 would not maybe be as strong, although it does lead to some complications. After queen c2, rook c1, queen e4, the position is highly complicated. So the simple way for white to deal with it, queen d2, and once the queens are off the board, these bishops are quite strong, and this pawn is really a very big threat for the enemy. So black would not be really happy to play out this position. Bishop a6 may be following out, but after knight f3, and white does have two couple of strong pawns here, which would be favorable for white here. The d4 pawn also is not something to be bragging about because it's quite weak this on d4. So I believe white would be slightly better here. Clearly here, black wanted rook g8. Although interestingly here, king f8 is played often, more so, not really that often, but more so. We have seen some couple of games in king f8 here earlier, and I believe this move is most synonymous with the idea because the king on f8, the rook on h8, bishop b5 check no longer a possibility. Maybe white would continue with some ideas of rook h3, rook g3 and try to get something going on the f file. Some ideas like that would be happening on the board, but Nepo chose rook g8, and here Vachier went with bishop b5 check. Now bishop d3, which is more natural here with the idea of bishop h7, and we can be enlightened with a nice variation here for black. Maybe this was the idea behind Nepo's rook g8. He had prepared this or so. Bishop h7 and cd4 followed by queen c4, and this is the reason. This is a very complicated move here to be played out because after bishop g8 we have queen f1, king d2, and just simply knight into g8. Now the point is that white is having difficulties getting his development going because neither can he move the knight to f3 because of the h1 rook hanging, neither can he move the bishop because the b1 rook is hanging. So he's tied out in quite a bind here, and the king on d2 is once again in a very awkward state here. Let's say he goes with queen into g7. This would be met with something like either queen into f2, king c3 and knight c6, which is even better for black. If white tries too hard, black can even get better because after queen g8, king d7 and queen into a8, we simply have queen into d4 followed by king b3 and bishop c4. King a4 is pretty much forced. This would be met with bishop a2, and we have a spectacular mate coming in. King b5, queen c4, that would be terrible. And after rook b4, we have b5, king into b5, queen b6, king a4 and queen a6. And we have a mate on board here, which would be a spectacular sight. But I'm sure that players of such caliber would not be having such positions on board for us to witness. But that would be an entirely different story. But I'm sure that if this happened on the board, king d1 would be played out and that would have been a draw. Maybe this was Nepo's idea and thus he went with rook g8, but Vachier disappointed him with bishop b5 check, following the same idea that Kirill followed in the game. If bishop d7, he would be retreating back the bishop to d3 and this game would go on. But here Nepo played king f8, and that sticks to the principle of this idea here. Black will be trying to play bishop a6 and get rid of white's bishop, light square bishop. White just went with bishop d3, bishop a6 and d into c5. White had other ways to continue with bishop a6 or so, but d into c5 is indeed the best move in the position. And now if queen into e5, this would be met with knight e2, and black cannot really capture back on c5 because bishop f4 would simply cost him a piece on b8, and that would be highly detrimental. But in the game, he played bishop d3 and after cd3 and knight d7. Once again, queen e5, knight e2, bc5, bishop f4, as we have seen earlier, would just simply cost black a piece here. And so knight d7 was played, keeping the option of playing knight into e5 also. So white played d4 here, defending everything. After bc5, queen d1. Now, why queen d1 here in this position is an interesting thing to talk about. See, the queen has been doing a good job here, like made black's pieces bad here. King f8, g8 is not really something to be liking about in the position. Black would have preferred his pieces to be inverted around to the other side, the king on g8, rook on f8, but that's not the case here. So the queen has pretty much done its job there, and if white goes with something like knight f3, which is also possible, but the queen would probably be needed on somewhere here on d1 to keep control over the queen side, better control of the queen side. As you can see that we have lost a light square bishop, so black does have some possibilities along this diagonal. The king is still in the center, so it would be entirely a good choice to keep the queen on d1 and then go with knight f3 or so, because the queen can stay closer to the queen side for some defense. The queen has done its job, it's time to retreat it back. Queen a5 and bishop d2, and here also black had an interesting decision because queen a3 is indeed possible to win the pawn, but white continues with knight e2, and black cannot play rook b8 because rook a1 would cost that pawn on a7. So if black tries to retreat his queen back, the problem is that black, once again, this is the biggest problem here for black. His pieces are in the wrong spots and they are they're going to cause some problems. White will just castle maybe and then continue with some ideas, maybe trying to get f4, f5, or maybe even align his pieces on the queen side. This pawn is not really something to be worried about yet, and black cannot, it's not really an utility for black at the moment, because the pawn is not going to pass. It's not going to become a pass pawn pretty fast here in this position. So considering so many pieces on the board, white has a lot of play, and once you capture that pawn, he gets even more play, considering a file and b file are both open now. So maybe that's the reason Nepo did not capture on a3 and instead went with rook b8, going for some exchanges. Knight e2, this position was very well thought out by Vachier, because if he prepared this at home, it's very nice, because if you look at it as an overview, it looks pretty simple, but actually it's pretty difficult for black to come out with an actual move here. Here Nepo went with c4, although if you look at something else, like let's say rook b1, queen b1 and queen a3, that would just simply allow queen b7, which should be pretty much lost. The queen has entered into black's camp now, and if black tries to hold everything together, the other way to continue, maybe something like rook b6 after castle. Like, once again, it's difficult for black to actually come up with a plan here. Like, it's not really possible to come up with a solid plan. He cannot really open with g5 or g6, because at g6, once again, this h6 pawn is weak. f5 will just give away the f4 square. So after ef6 and knight f4, that would also be highly detrimental here. So it's very difficult for black to actually come up with a plan. Nepo chose c4 here, trying to lock out on the queen side. But after this, we have a very good display of skill by Vachier, like how he exactly played out his position, and this is a very nice to learn from. So after castle, rook b6, queen c2. Well, queen c2 keeps some options of going to h7 if that's needed, but also the possibility of going for f4, f5 somewhere and supporting that idea. Rook h8. Like I said earlier, it's difficult for black to actually play out this position, and thus a move like rook h8, we cannot really blame Nepo for it. Maybe he was trying to activate the king via g8 or so, or maybe try to frustrate his idea of playing g6 somewhere later. So with those ideas in mind, he went with rook h8 here. But there was another plan that he could have followed, that is maybe something like knight b8 and king e8, king d7. But still, I believe white will be better in some way or the other. He could follow this plan of a4 and rook b4 and maybe f4, f5 somewhere later, or something. Also, it's very difficult for black to actually align his pieces. Let's say we can continue with f4 and maybe even knight g3 and try to get f5 here, which would also be strong for us in the game. So it would be a better idea for black to follow knight b8 maybe, or something which should be relatively possible here. But rook h8 is a little slow, and that's we'll see how it exactly went out. Here went with a4, and this is a beautiful move by Vachier. The same thing he kind of did against Grishuk in one of the games earlier, because his idea is to try to activate the bishop via c1. That game did not turn out into his favor and turned a draw. This game, we shall see how it went on, so stay tuned. a4 and maybe trying to activate the bishop via c1. That's a very strong idea. Well, maybe not immediately, then somewhere later down the road. King e8 was played, and that's exactly what we see. So the problem with Nepo is that he's not able to actually make sure what exactly is going to work out well. He could have done this a move earlier also, but it's a difficult position anyways. Rook b4 was played out, some ideas of doubling out, but also luring black to play this move knight c6. And here white went with another surprising brilliant move, which is f4. Now this was definitely not the strongest move according to the engine. Rook b6 was preferred by the engine, but I really agree with the move f4, and I like the beauty of it, because black cannot really take on b4 here. C into b4. Now rook into b4 would just be terrible, because queen c3 would just simply pick us up a piece. The rook cannot move and the pin is fatal. But after queen a6, white can just continue with f5, and black has absolutely nothing that he can do. We should not forget that the king has already moved, so he cannot castle. And after f e6 and queen g6, black is just in a very difficult state, and not something that anybody would want to be in. So Nepo clearly did not capture and went back on e7 here, supporting this f5 idea. White just went with rook b1. Maybe some ideas of playing rook b5, and also we should not forget that bishop c1, a3 is another idea that white can follow here in this position. Black played f5. Now this was not possible a move or two earlier, because there was no pawn on f4. So after ef6, knight f6, white would be getting his knight to f4, which would be quite fatal, as we had seen earlier. But since there's a pawn on f4, ef6 no longer is a good way to continue, because this instead gives black the square on e4. It would be an interesting choice, but not something that would be necessary here for white. So white just continued on the other side with rook b5 and queen a6 and followed the simple idea, bishop c1, trying to transfer the bishop to a3 and activate it towards a much active square. Now, for a moment, it seems like black has got some relief, and thus he went with king f7, trying to get his other rook into the game. But after bishop a3, rook b8, once again, Vachier had a surprise for us, and if you can, you could pause the video and see and try to figure out what plan Vachier continued with here. Well, if you did find out what black did next here, then that's quite nice. Bishop into e7 was indeed the move that Vachier played out in this position, and that's not really a spectacular move, but an odd choice considering that the bishop is so much stronger than this knight on e7. Well, why would he take it? But the point is, black has an immediate threat of taking rook b5. Like if just I play something king f2, rook b5 would be fatal for white here because the a3 bishop is hanging. So ab5, queen a3 would be fatal. That's one reason white could have dealt with it, something like rook b4, keeping this bishop on the board and taking care of the threat. But bishop e7 is even stronger because g4 next is the move that you had to be looking for if you saw the plan bishop e7, because this just opens up everything on the king side, and since black has just moved his rook to b8, that is even more of a problem because he has less defense on the king side now. Rook b5 was played out by Nepo. Fg4 would be met with rook b6, and after rook b6 something like rook f1, shifting the rook to the other side, again opening up some possibilities of f5 and queen g6. But if you have something better that you found out, you could also mention it in the comment section below for sure. I would be really interested in seeing it because there are different ways for white to actually continue here in this position. f5 also I believe would be a strong way to continue because white does get some ideas of knight f4. May not be the best variation but should be better for white nevertheless. In the game he went with rook b5, clearly like he's trying to get some complications going on the other side so that both will be playing on one wing now. White will be playing on the king side, black will be playing on the queen side. So after rook f5, gf5, rook into b1, queen into b1, e into f5, and once again perfect chess here by Vachier. Knight g3 played out on the board, not queen into f5, simply allowing black some possibilities of queen a1 or something like queen e6. Like you could use your knight in the game, so knight g3 is the way to continue to try to get your knight also into the game towards the attack. Queen b6, trying to exchange the queens, knight f5, king f8, and queen a1, a simple move, avoiding the exchange, opening up queen a3 ideas, and also keeping the flexibility of maybe going with the queen to the other side if that's needed. Queen e6, knight g3. Now you would say, why not queen a3 first? Well, after king g8, knight g3, once again black gets some possibilities for some counterplay, right? So Vachier doesn't really want to allow that entirely. Maybe queen into f4 is also falling at the moment, but the main thing is he's simply allowing some additional counterplay. So after knight g3, king g4 and queen g2, now black went ahead and captured on f4. Like black doesn't really have much to do here else than capturing because the knight cannot really maneuver to a better square and try to get something going. So after queen f4, queen into a7, we can see that this is pretty much fatal because surprisingly, knight really doesn't have a good square to go to. If black had gone with something like queen f7, queen a8 check, and queen into d5, that would simply cost him another pawn. King e7, I believe queen a3 and queen d6 again would be fatal. So black went for something with king e7, and this was met with queen a3, king d8, and queen d6. Now d5 is falling, and if the queen moves, e6 is a strong threat. So both are things to worry about. Is pretty much the position is falling apart already for Nepo. So he tried something very desperate with g5. Now queen into d5 also would be winning, but Vachier gives no chances and simply captures it. Really not respecting what Nepo is trying to do here, and actually there is nothing because after h5 and g7, Nepo just had enough and resigned. He cannot really do queen g4. Like I said earlier, e6 should be fatal as it is. Queen f7 would meet the same fate with e6, so it's pretty much winning, and Nepo just conceded here in this position. Well, a beautiful display of chess here by Vachier, a good opening choice here. Well, as we can see, the position was not really easy to understand what was really happening at the initial stages, but as the game went along, Vachier displayed very nice play, perfect play to be honest, and just converted it beautifully. Well, the candidates gets even more interesting because Nepo had taken a huge lead. Now Vachier is chasing him. The other players are getting back into the game and getting back into the tournament, my bad, and it is a very interesting thing to see. We'll hope for more such games, and I will see you soon in the next video. Well, If you did like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and press the bell icon to stay updated. I will see you soon in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and see you.